to Through the Looking Glass podcast. My name is Lavanya. My goal is to empower listeners, even in the smallest way possible, and improve your well-being. If you found my podcast and enjoying it, please take a minute to follow and rate the show. It really would make a huge difference for a brand new show and lets me know I'm doing a good job. Dr. Nadia, welcome to Through the Looking Glass. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. So to everyone who's listening, I have Dr. Nadia Huq on today. She's a clinical psychologist who specializes in family and children, and she's on here today to talk about some interesting questions, particularly to do with having a South Asian family. Do you have any kind of introduction you want to share about yourself, about your background?
Um, well, you said it. So I'm Dr. Nadia Huq. I'm a clinical psychologist, mainly work with children and families, and I do a lot of parenting work. And one of my passions is really also just to spread awareness about mental health in the South Asian community and immigrant families. It's still pretty it can be taboo, hard to talk about, and I want more people talking about it. So I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that you've created the space to do so. So thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to start the podcast was because I felt like not only women, but particularly South Asian women didn't really have a strong voice or many voices really in the podcasting space. Maybe it's like the business side of my brain kind of it clicked that this was something that aligned with my creative energy and I wanted
Mhm.
to pursue it and add my own voice to the mix. And it's great to, bring in guests like yourself who can speak with authority on certain topics. Could you tell me more about the typical gender roles in South Asian communities, South Asian families? How has that been playing out?
Um, And I will acknowledge, yes, mental health is such a big topic,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people approach me and want to talk about it, and we could talk for days.
Mm-hmm.
So we won't get to it all today, but so
Mm-hmm.
gender roles.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of things I want to say about that. First,
Mm-hmm.
even just the South Asian community itself, we're not, all the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of variability in South Asians.
Yeah.
There's a lot of just
Mm-hmm.
intersection of different identities, religion, immigration status. Like there's so many things that can
Mm-hmm.
impact a family's values. And yeah, there are a lot of shared things, but I've
Yeah.
really found also that just over the
Mm-hmm.
years, working with different families and myself and my experiences, it
Mm-hmm.
really can vary family to family, right? So
Mm-hmm.
not all one, but if you're really thinking about traditional, kind of gender roles,
Mm-hmm.
it's, I think, what a lot of
Yeah.
people think of, right? Like the man, the
Mm-hmm.
father, the husband, whatever, goes to work and makes the money and provides financially. And the
Mm-hmm.
female, is more in the home and taking care of the home and the kids. I will
Mm-hmm.
say that I've seen a huge shift, though, just even in one
Okay.
generation of
Mm-hmm.
more balance, right? And just
Right.
roles in the home because when men and women are working outside of the
Mm-hmm.
home. So I think those kind of deep rooted things are there. It's hard to kind of move away from
Mm-hmm.
generations and generations of the way things used to be
Yeah.
done. But, I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing a lot of shifting happening as well, which I think is good.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Even, in my own experience, my immediate family, that is, they're very, like the traditional, like you said, my mom stayed at home for like most of her career. She, was taking care of us predominantly, and they had, moved to a new country. So there's a lot of layers of, adjustment, with
Yeah.
that shift and finding a whole other community coming from another country. They have like a
Hmm.
whole other, experience versus the kids, who either if you were like born in America or if you, came here at a really young age, like myself, you kind of have like a whole other kind of like experience that you're dealing with, right? Like you said, it's still kind of like a completely different flavor, and it can kind of vary. I know, like some of my friends, either like they didn't grow up around a lot of Indian families, or they kind of had the
Hmm.
opposite,
Hmm.
where they were around a lot of Indian families and stuff like that. So it can kind of be like very, very different in your practice. What are some things that, South Asian second generation kids are experiencing? Like, what are some, if there is any trends, like what are things that seems like there's a commonality in the difficulties that they're facing?
Yeah. So, there's been a lot of research on this, like in the last,
Mm-hmm.
few decades, which is nice,
Uh-huh.
about kids whose parents were immigrants and
Mm-hmm.
they were born and raised in the US, right? And so it's actually one of the things
Mm-hmm.
I studied when I was in graduate school. And there's a term for it. It's
Mm-hmm.
called acculturation conflict or acculturation gaps, which
Mm-hmm.
really gets to this
Okay.
like immigrant parent came to the US
Mm-hmm.
and US born kids and
Mm-hmm.
the kind of clashing that can happen there and the values
Mm-hmm.
differences. What I will say that if, you know, what we know research wise and what I've seen clinically is when there
Mm-hmm.
is a lot of that conflict, parent child conflict, and those kind of values clashes or whatever may be happening as parents are trying to hold
Mm-hmm.
on to their culture and children are like, but I'm American, right? And
Yeah.
the more conflict there is, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
kids are more likely to have anxiety, depression, lower self esteem,
Mm-hmm.
so that conflict does
Yeah.
have an impact. And with that said, it's not
Mm-hmm.
necessary that every family is having that, right? So
Yeah.
in families where the conflict is lower, kids do better, right? Like they
Mm-hmm.
adjust.
Yeah.
So I think that is one piece that
Mm-hmm.
if that conflict is high and kids and parents are not kind of able to communicate and navigate those challenges, that there is, unfortunately, repercussions for that. The other thing
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing is, and also kind of clinically, but research wise, folks that are like myself, right? So my parents were
Mm-hmm.
immigrants. I was born and raised in Florida with my siblings. There are certain people
Mm-hmm.
who, with all that, were able to really kind of develop a strong ethnic identity, right? Like, oh, I'm South Asian American, or I'm American and I'm South Asian. And
Mm-hmm.
for folks we see that really have strong, just like ethnic
Right.
identity or a strong
Mm-hmm.
just connection and confidence in who they are, tend to do
Mm-hmm.
well. Folks that really
Mm-hmm.
struggle with that like identity development and those things that are kind of crucial when you're an adolescent,
Mm-hmm.
they tend to have more challenges. So again,
Right.
it is not necessarily this like uniform what's happening to everyone. It's really
Mm-hmm.
dependent upon, how supportive is your family? How's communication in your family? Do you guys talk about things like, is there's this
Mm-hmm.
clash between like
Yeah.
how you should identify, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
kind, those clashing and conflict tend to be more detrimental. Um, so
Right.
that is kind of a lot of where my passion is research wise. I used to do a lot in
Yeah.
graduate school and
Mm-hmm.
clinically more about what I do now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. And it's definitely super interesting for me to hear about. And
Hmm.
I think a lot of listeners will also resonate because maybe, like I'm listening to you and I'm kind of thinking back to, like, personally, for me, I feel like I went through a phase in my early 20s where there
Yeah.
was that kind of like communication struggles with my family. And,
Hmm.
I'll let you kind of maybe give tips on if you are having, quote unquote, fights with your family, or let's say disagreements on
Hmm.
you being, true to your identity, but also your parents wanting you to, still stay Indian, that
Hmm.
sort of like dynamic. I think I've seen a lot, for myself or even amongst my friends. That's one particular thing that can cause a lot of tension. So how do you create this open line of communication with your parents? Maybe, they're from an older generation, they have a different
Hmm.
ideology. How do you kind of cut through that?
Right. I wish I had like a magic wand to make it all easy. It's challenging, right? I mean, it
Yeah.
is so hard. Um,
Mm-hmm.
one of the first things I tell families that I work with, and sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
I work with the parent, and sometimes I'm working with the teen, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I'm working with young
Yeah.
kids and their parents, right? So I do kind of have
Mm-hmm.
this like variety. And one of the first things
Mm-hmm.
I tell folks is to, be open
Mm-hmm.
to acknowledge that both sides can be
Mm-hmm.
struggling, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's hard to be a parent raising a child
Mm-hmm.
in a country different
Yeah.
than where you grew up. And it's hard to be a kid growing up in a country where your parents didn't grow up, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's not, I like for families to not think of like me against my parents or kids against my parents. Like, you guys are
Mm-hmm.
like, this family unit as a unit, and everyone is struggling with the similar thing, just different ends of it, right? So
Right.
the first step is just
Yeah.
like, even I tell people to step back for a moment. And if they're the child, be like, think about, yeah, this was hard for your
Mm-hmm.
parents too. Imagine what that was like. And even telling
Mm-hmm.
parents, like, imagine what that is like to be a kid who grows up without people looking like them. Like, when you grew up in wherever, India,
Mm-hmm.
Bangladesh, Pakistan, like, you went to school with
Mm-hmm.
everyone that looked like you, right? And sometimes I
Yeah.
think just taking a moment to let people think about the other perspective is so key. It
Mm-hmm.
sounds so simple, but I think if you can just take a moment and understand, like, wow, like, that's why my mom acts like that sometimes. Like, gosh, like,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
That's a good step. I think as much as possible, of course, open communication. And it's hard, right? Sometimes people like dig their
Mm-hmm.
heels in with their points of view,
Right.
and it changes as you get older. When you're a teenager or a
Mm-hmm.
kid, there's a certain way, right, to interact with your parents. The
Yeah.
older you get, the more you can have those adult conversations. I encourage it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
I remember actually, and a funny story, as you bring
Mm-hmm.
this up, it totally made me think about my mom.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in America. She grew up in Bangladesh, my siblings and I. So all this like classic, like
Mm-hmm.
we talk about classic, like parents,
Yeah.
my parents were brown and grew up somewhere else. And I grew up in America. My siblings and I like
Mm-hmm.
had this very, you know, similar experience. And I remember
Yeah.
one time in college, actually, I moved away for college, and my mom one day out of nowhere, I don't even remember what we were talking about, was like,
Mm-hmm.
I used to think that my generation had it hard because we had to like move to a different country as adults, but now I realize your generation had
Mm-hmm.
it harder. Growing up somewhere where you had to balance
Mm-hmm.
two cultures, like that was actually
Right.
harder than what we had to do. And I was like, what?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. That's what we've
Yeah.
been telling you, right?
It's
So,
like, wait, you
all that
agree
to,
with me?
yeah, all that to say that sometimes it just
Mm-hmm.
takes time for people to really step back and like
Mm-hmm.
have the space to think
Yeah.
about the other perspective. But that was really healing for
Mm-hmm.
me. Like, oh, mom finally gets it,
Yeah.
right? When we were fighting when I was
Mm-hmm.
a teenager, she didn't get it then. But
Yeah.
like, here she
Mm-hmm.
is. So I think as much open communication, but it comes back to having like having secure relationships. That's what I tell the people I work with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, as much as possible, I recommend like nurturing
Mm-hmm.
that relationship that you have with siblings and parents and families, because when you have a good
Mm-hmm.
like a relationship, it's easier to communicate. It's not easy, but it's
Right.
easier
Yeah.
when you have that kind
Mm-hmm.
of
Yeah.
dynamic where
Right. Yeah. And
you can talk.
the older, I get, and I'm like almost in my 30s at this point, and I
Yeah.
think like looking back at my 20s, there's that phase of like where you're still kind of like treated like you're a teenager when you're like, an
Oh yeah.
undergrad and stuff like that. And then
Mm-hmm.
over time you kind of switch roles almost where you're less kid and like more of like a friend, which I feel like is a
Mm-hmm.
helpful way to kind of make your relationship stronger over time.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for, women, particularly in their 20s, where maybe they're struggling a little bit to, like have more of a healthy relationship with their family members? Maybe they, don't really get treated like an adult. How do you kind of go through that transition from being a kid to, I want to be respected as an adult?
Right. Well, your parents will always see you as a kid, their kid, right? So that's kind of like,
Yeah, yeah.
you will always be a kid to your parents, which is also
Mm,
a beautiful thing. Um, and I don't think that's unique to South Asians, right? That's just like
yeah.
what you talked about also is like just like a developmental thing. Like 20s are kind of weird,
Mm,
right? You just finished
yeah.
college, you like don't have money yet,
Mm-hmm.
really, like so like
Yeah.
you kind of sometimes need help and you may have to move back
Mm-hmm.
home. Like you're still trying to
Yeah.
navigate all these things. What
Mm-hmm.
I would say to a person in their 20s who is trying to
Mm-hmm.
navigate all the different things. First and foremost, I think it's really important for people and women to kind of just like look within and see like what are my values? Like what do I value?
Mm-hmm.
And doing what you can to live your
Mm-hmm.
life in line with their values, right? So for
Mm-hmm.
someone who it's a high like a really top value or
Mm-hmm.
priority to like have a good relationship with your parents, right? And so do
Mm-hmm.
may not always, be fun and it may be a little annoying, but if that's something you value and that's a big
Mm-hmm.
part of something that's important to you, to think about how can you maintain that relationship, right? If your number one value is like, I want to get a job that pays the most money, right? Live
Mm-hmm.
your life in that way to like work towards that. If your value, you're in your 20s and you're like, I want to get married and I want to have children young, like that's important to me,
Mm-hmm.
do that or work towards that, right? There really is
Right.
no right answer besides, you know, doing what's important for you and in line
Mm-hmm.
with your values, right?
Right.
I don't know if that's that's kind of a generic thing, but I think that,
Yeah. That's
uh,
part of being in your 20s, figuring out what
yeah,
your values are. Yeah, that's a huge part of it. And family's a big part
yeah,
of it too, because I
yeah,
think particularly South Asian families, they always want the best for you in,
mm,
in their heart, right? So they're kind of pushing you to like do your best and do more. It's kind of part of
yeah,
our culture a little bit. And that can
yeah,
be, tough to, digest and handle too, because
hmm,
everyone kind of has like different levels of ambition or life goals or even personal values, and everyone's kind
right,
of moving at like different speeds too. And I think all of that is a lot to kind of, like you said, 20s are just this chaotic time period
hmm,
where you're dealing with all of these different layers, right? I want to ask you more about the kind of digging a little bit deeper into the family relationships. uh, I think like I always say this to, on my podcast and, even with my friends, that even when you have like a difficult conversation or you have, a really bad fight with a parent or, a sibling or something, at the core of it that that person really loves you and they're trying to
hmm,
advocate for something that they believe is best for you, right?
hmm,
But I
hmm,
also think that there may be times where the advice that you might be getting from your family is not the best thing for you. So
hmm.
how do you like what are some signs or like what are ways to better identify something that might be detrimental to your own mental health, let's say.
Yeah. So many things. Yes. I'm just like as you're talking, I'm thinking about how
Mm-hmm.
my mom was like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, gotta get married, but you gotta get an education. You gotta get an
Mm-hmm.
education." Like you're told to do
Yeah.
all these things at once, right? God
Yeah.
bless her. I love my
Yeah.
mom. So what I will say to that is that
Mm-hmm.
first and foremost, we can only
Mm-hmm.
control our own thoughts and behaviors and our own actions, right? So I think lots of times when
Mm-hmm.
folks come to me, your family's like, oh, like I can't stand when X does this, or this is what happens. And like,
Mm-hmm.
how do I get them to change? How do I get them to change? How do I get them to see? And the truth is, uh,
Mm-hmm.
we can't change other people. We truly can.
Mm-hmm.
We can
It's
only
true.
change the way we react to certain situations, the situations we
Mm-hmm.
put ourselves in, And so, what I will say to that is ideally in my career, I want families to get
Mm-hmm.
along, right? In my heart of hearts and
Mm-hmm.
what I do, like that's my goal, right? For
Yeah.
families to get along, for parents and their children
Mm-hmm.
to have good relationships, for people to communicate. Because I think relationships in general, family, friendships, right, are super
Mm-hmm.
important, right? That's one of the most important things
Mm-hmm.
um, we have. If someone, I would first tell someone, set your boundaries, of course, like if there's certain
Yeah.
things that like are really, upsetting and you can't make the person stop, and kind of like setting your boundary.
Mm-hmm.
But the
Mm-hmm.
way to identify, I think, if someone is, I guess, harmful to you, that's, I think, what you're getting at, right? If like someone's kind of like
Mm-hmm.
really just like not good for you.
Yeah.
I think if someone's really impacting your self-esteem, right? If someone's making you feel bad
Mm-hmm.
about yourself, or you find
Mm-hmm.
yourself a lot more anxious around someone, or every time you talk
Mm-hmm.
to them, you feel more down and it's just like bringing you down, I think that's
Right.
definitely unhealthy, right? Now,
Mm-hmm.
do many of us have conversations with our parents where they try to like put us in check and we're annoyed? Yes,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a level of that as you get older. Again, it's like a developmental thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a part of being a teenager, right? And it's a part of young
Mm-hmm.
adulthood. Your parents tell you this, that, and the other. Um, the
Yeah.
older we get, like 20s and 30s, if it's feeling like
Mm-hmm.
someone is really impacting our mood, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's important to be intentional about that relationship, and
Okay.
thinking about like, okay, like what can I do so that every
Mm-hmm.
time, I see so and so, I'm not like in bed for a weekend upset at what we talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Right,
so,
right.
yeah, I think that's like one way to think about it.
Paying attention to your reactions and not just something momentary annoyance, but a pattern or something that's kind of bringing you down over a long period of time. Like those are things that you should look out for to kind of assess like
Right.
how toxic is this kind of thing. Yeah,
Right. Because we
yeah,
all get
that makes
like,
sense.
have hear
Hmm.
this, that, and the other from a parent or
Yeah.
whomever, especially in South
Hmm.
Asian community, everyone has
Right.
something to say, right? Aunts and uncles, and like
Yeah.
everyone
Yeah.
has something to say, which there's a
Yeah.
sweetness about
Hmm.
that for sure. There's a value in
Hmm.
that. But if it's like,
Hmm.
yeah, if you're really noticing that this is just like this pattern that keeps
Hmm.
happening and it's really starting to
Yeah.
impact your sense of self, and you're someone in
Hmm.
your 20s or 30s, and it's, I think, to evaluate a little bit on how to
Yeah.
not necessarily cut that person off or anything like that, but think about what
Hmm.
you can do
Right.
to potentially help that be a healthier situation for
Hmm.
you.
Right, right. You mentioned setting boundaries. Can you give some
Mhm.
examples of like, you know, how to set a boundary or maybe some like, I don't know, sometimes like setting boundaries feels like a generic thing, but in the moment maybe you don't know what to say specifically. I am not giving you
Yeah.
like a scenario, but if you want to like help with specific examples that someone can apply.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. Yeah, boundaries. Like if we talk to our
Mhm.
moms about it, they'd be like, "What boundaries? Brown people don't have boundaries, right?" Like this is
Right.
brown
Yeah.
boundary talk, right? Like, um, I think that it's hard to set boundaries when you're young, especially in a South
Hmm.
Asian family,
Yeah.
right? Like it's a kind of like,
Hmm.
you do as I say. Uh,
Yeah.
it gets easier as you get older. I know you're still in your 20s.
Right.
I'm in my late
Yeah.
30s.
Hmm.
I if I could talk to the younger version of myself, I would say, like hang in
Hmm.
there. I promise it gets easier. Your parents do start to see
Yeah.
you more as an adult, and there is this natural progression of
Hmm.
things that happens, right? Uh,
Hmm.
Teens and 20s are hard. They just really are.
Yeah.
20s is like an
Right.
extended
Right.
adolescence, I feel.
Yeah.
It does get easier. What I will say about boundaries, I
Hmm.
have actually this funny memory. It's so fun. I haven't even thought about this in a
Hmm.
long time because
Yeah.
I was in college. So this was some time ago. I was in my
Hmm.
20s, early 20s or whatever. Maybe I was 19,
Hmm.
20. And I moved away. I lived in Florida. I went to the University of Michigan
Hmm.
for college.
Hmm.
I was lucky because my dad was really supportive of me going out of state
Right.
for college. But my
Yeah.
immigrant brown
Hmm.
mother was like, no, like that's too
Hmm.
far, whatever, whatever.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I went, and she had one
Hmm.
stipulation that if I went,
Hmm.
if she agreed to let me go out of state, I would have to like
Yeah.
call her every day. Right.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I'm 38 and I like still call my mom every day. It's so funny, the patterns
Hmm.
that stick. But uh, I remember clearly walking one day and I called her as I was walking to class. Like college,
Hmm.
there's so much going on, friendships and school and
Yeah.
all this like fun stuff. You're like
Yeah.
finally on your own. And I called my
Mm-hmm.
mom, which I usually did as I was walking to class,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
that was the time I had to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Oh, you forgot your mother," or some like passive aggressive, like dramatic brown mom thing to say, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, I remember she used to say that a lot, and I would just like ignore
Mm-hmm.
it. And I remember that day I was like,
Mm-hmm.
Mom, I called
Mm-hmm.
you, but if every time
Yeah.
I call you, you say that, I'm gonna stop calling.
Yeah.
If you want to say you miss me, just say you miss me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like,
Right.
and I just like laid her straight, and she never said that again. The whole like, oh, you forgot about your mother. I haven't heard from you in 24 hours, right? Like, so it's like
Yeah.
seems so
You
small,
were like
but that was
applying what you were learning in school real time.
yeah, well, then I wasn't even in grad school. This was like undergrad, right? So
Got it. Got it.
this
Yeah.
was just like I'm tired of every
Mm-hmm.
time I call my mom to talk to her
Mm-hmm.
for her to like guilt trip me about why I didn't
Yeah.
call
Yep.
sooner or why
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, if you keep saying
Mm-hmm.
that, I'm gonna just stop calling. So if you miss
Yeah.
me, just like let's talk. How was your day? Can you ask me how my
Mm-hmm.
day was? Right?
Yeah.
So it was like this,
Yeah.
and then she never guilt trips me again. But now looking,
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't thinking of it then, but that's kind of like boundary setting,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Yeah,
if
that's true.
every time I call, you guilt trip me about not calling,
Mm-hmm.
forgetting about your mother, I'm gonna stop
Mm-hmm.
calling because I don't want to hear
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So I think boundary setting could look a lot of ways, but just it doesn't have to be
Mm-hmm.
this like mean and intense, like cold thing.
Mm-hmm.
It could just be
Yeah.
like, I miss you, mom. I love talking to you. But if every
Mm-hmm.
time I call you, you're gonna nag me about whatever, like I'm gonna stop calling.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So,
Yeah.
like, I think just being clear and,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, letting whomever know, like, this is what the boundary is. And
Yeah.
if you break it, like,
That's a
this
really
is
good
what's going to happen.
example. Yeah.
Uh,
I think we've all
so, yeah.
experienced like some version of that sort of guilt tripping because I kind of have
Yeah.
like a similar experience too because um I was in the same state for undergrad, but once I was done with undergrad, since then I've lived in another state from my parents. So
Mhm.
they would want me to like call pretty often, and I usually call them when I'm driving home, kind of thing. And I
Yep.
remember like your story was making me remember this, where my mom would be like something about like how oh you just like only call me when you drive, like you don't like
Yeah.
set time aside for me or
I
something really
know.
dramatic like that.
Yeah.
And I told her, kind of similar to like what you said, well, if you don't want to talk to me when I'm driving, then you can only talk to me on the weekend. So, like, it was kind of like take it or leave it kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, like, she stopped
Appropriate.
complaining. Yeah.
Appropriate boundary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, okay, like if you don't like this, then I'll just talk
Hmm.
to you on the weekend.
Yeah.
But yes, and I think that's also though
Hmm.
reflective of our culture where
Hmm.
people don't really necessarily express. It's like a very indirect, like they want to
Hmm.
like go roundabout on what they want
Yeah.
to say. At that moment, your mom was
Right.
probably like, I miss my girl. And like she's
Yeah.
so important to me. And she's probably wondering, like, how important am I
Yeah.
to her? Like she's probably all in her
Hmm.
feelings. But the
Hmm.
only way that it could come out was like, oh, you only have time for me when you drive. There's nothing else to do. Like,
Yeah.
so it's easier to laugh
That's so
about it when
true.
you're
I never
older.
thought about it too much. Yeah.
It's you can laugh about it when you're older, but that stuff is so annoying when you're
Hmm.
younger, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Do you feel
yeah.
like, don't mind me asking, like, do you already have kids?
I do. I don't mind at all. Yes, I have two
Yeah.
kids,
Hmm.
lovely little
Yeah.
girls. They're
Hmm.
almost 4 and almost
Uh-huh.
6. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I am busy. And it's funny you bring
Hmm.
that story up about you
Right.
driving. So I used to
Yeah.
work in New York
Hmm.
City for a long
Hmm.
time. So I worked in a hospital for about 7 years,
Hmm.
and I would always talk to my mom on my commute. Right? Like,
Yeah.
because that's when no one
Hmm.
else needed me. My kids weren't calling me. Like,
Yeah.
I wasn't working. So I
Right.
always called her on her commute.
Yeah.
And I had
Hmm.
transitioned from that job to private practice a year
Hmm.
ago. And just
Hmm.
literally, I think 2 days ago, my mom was like, oh,
Hmm.
I thought you'd be less busy when you left your hospital job, but you used to call me more then. And I was like,
Yeah.
yeah, mom, because I used to
Yeah.
call you on my like 45-minute commute home.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm
Right.
busy
Right.
now. Like I'm
Yeah.
doing a lot of things. Like the
Hmm.
kids,
Hmm.
when they're home, it's like, mommy, 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 mommy. But
Yeah.
yeah, like I'm 38 and my mom's still like complaining about
Hmm.
me not calling her enough.
Yeah.
So
So I think what
There's
you're telling
some
us
things
is
that don't
never gonna
change.
stop.
It doesn't bother me as
It's
much
always good.
though.
Yeah. Okay, we should put it that way for listeners that it'll
Yeah.
stop bothering you over time, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes, I
Um.
love that reframe.
Mhm.
Think about, this is how my parent is showing me that they love me,
Mhm.
and this
Yeah.
is the way that my parent is
Mhm.
expressing they miss me and want to talk to me more,
Yeah.
and this is the best way
Mhm.
they know how to say it. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
That's true. And I think a lot of times, like, in our examples that we were talking about, a lot of our family members, they didn't really have the time or space in their life to develop their own like maturity levels or develop their own self as an individual. And I think that's like a very unique thing that, our generation has gotten to do, maybe because I don't know if it's a generational thing or like growing up abroad. There's we just take more time. Like we got multiple degrees, possibly like lived on our own before getting married, like all of these kind of life phases that helps you, I think, be more of like your individual person kind of thing. And I've noticed that a lot that we have that opportunity to do. And I kind of think
Mhm.
about that in contrast to what, at least like my mom was in her like, she was like 23 or 24 when she had me. So she barely got to be a person before, she had
Mhm.
kids, right? So I like sometimes see that dynamic and it kind of comes out where, they never really got to like figure themselves out as a person. And, often, especially because, they were born and raised in India, they culturally they would get married like pretty young. I think that's like pretty common for most people,
Mhm.
right? So they never really got to like their own person. So there's that kind of disconnect, and sometimes there's a lot of like, I didn't get to do something, so I want my kids to do it. So there's this
Mhm.
kind of like pressure, for lack of a better word, to be this like overachiever or to, always be really good at something. And that can naturally, I think, also have the negative, effects of that because you might be feeling a lot of stress or maybe it's just, attacking like your own sense of confidence, right? So how do you have any suggestions on how to navigate that? Any, observations that you've come across so far in your practice?
And so many things. I think our moms are similar. My mom got married at 19,
Uh-huh.
started having kids
Uh-huh.
at 23, 24. Um,
Yeah.
One thing I'll say is it's definitely a privilege. Like we have this
Mm-hmm.
privilege to
Yeah.
have been able to
Mm-hmm.
grow up a little bit and not get, married
Mm-hmm.
so young unless we chose to, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But to go to
Yeah.
college and live on our own
Mm-hmm.
for a bit and go to different jobs, right? Like what a privilege that is,
Mm-hmm.
first of all, that
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
that we have. And
Mm-hmm.
there is this difference, right? And my mom, who
Yeah.
got married very young and had kids, like I think a part of
Mm-hmm.
that, what you're kind of getting at, is like that
Mm-hmm.
generation, especially for the women, the mothers, so much of their
Yeah.
identity is wrapped up in their motherhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like so much
Yeah.
of their identity and who they are, because being a mother is hard work. It's a lot of work. It's a
Mm-hmm.
job for
Yeah.
sure. And that's what they did.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think how that then comes out to us kids,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it kind of speaking from that
Yeah.
perspective is like,
Yeah.
man, like, why won't mom leave me alone about this or that? But it's
Right.
like, they,
Mm-hmm.
so much of their identity is wrapped up in
Mm-hmm.
motherhood. And I think that sometimes then can cause some of the tension that we all
Yeah.
feel
The
as,
friction. Mm-hmm.
yeah, the children of immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a part of it's just like, yes, accepting
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
is what it is, and that is the
Mm-hmm.
situation, and this
Mm-hmm.
pressure, yes, of our mothers, wanting to
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily live vicariously through us, but give us opportunities that maybe they didn't have, I
Mm-hmm.
think is a great thing. And also, you're right, it does cause a lot of
Yeah.
pressure. I saw this meme
Mm-hmm.
it was a couple of months back. I actually saw this meme,
Yeah.
which really I resonated with
Mm-hmm.
so much. It said it was something along
Yeah.
the lines of women of this generation that are growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of speaking to my age, like we were the
Mm-hmm.
generation who many of our
Mm-hmm.
mothers like stayed at home and did all the cooking and cleaning, all of that. But we were
Mm-hmm.
really like push to get educations and have careers. So we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do it, both of it. Like we're trying to do it all
Yes.
and we're
Yeah.
exhausted, right? Because like
Mm-hmm.
we were told, get an education, get a career, do all these beautiful things,
Right.
which we did,
Yeah.
but we grew up with that sense of like that home
Mm-hmm.
cooked meal every day and
Mm-hmm.
all those
Yeah.
wonderful things. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, trying to do it all is a lot, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it's a lot.
It's like can't be
Um,
everywhere at the same time, right? So it,
yeah.
it is like a really difficult thing to grapple with, especially, now that you have kids, like I'm sure that adds a whole other layer of wanting to be there for the kids and stuff like that,
Yeah.
right? Where you can never be, the like as good as your mom, like, in a way, because I think that too, where I would like almost compare myself to, what she could
Mhm.
do and stuff like that. And there's just like there's something that you just can't live up to, and maybe that's like an internal thing where
Mhm.
you're like
Mhm.
so worried about getting things right that um you're kind of like just had that like thought of oh my God, like someone else could do this better than I did, like I'm just like
Right.
barely holding it together, or like whatever those kind of um
Yeah.
spiraling thoughts that you do get when you're kind of having a bad day or something, right?
Right. And I think yes to all of that, and a lot of people have that. Everyone thinks everyone else can do something better, or most people, and that's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
not the case. But I think
Yeah.
you don't have to do everything
Hmm.
perfect, right? That's just, and one thing
Hmm.
in what I do, right? So I work with a lot of parents. I do a
Hmm.
lot of parenting work.
Yeah.
And one of the main things I tell parents is like, yes, of course, the
Hmm.
basics. Make sure your kid has a place to sleep, clothes, and,
Hmm.
food, and, right? We want to hit the
Yeah.
basics. But other than that, the
Hmm.
most important thing you can do, especially with a young child or as your kids are growing up,
Yeah.
is have a good relationship
Hmm.
with them. Have a warm,
Hmm.
like loving relationship, but firm boundaries also, right? So, like,
Right. Yeah.
and that balance is
Hmm.
that kind of healthy kind of attachment of like, oh, my
Yeah.
parent and I have a good relationship, but like mom is mom. And, you know,
Yeah.
when she says something,
Right.
I gotta do it, right? Like that kind of
Hmm.
secure relationship is actually really probably the most important thing you can do for your child, because then they grow up to
Hmm.
be older kids and teens and adults that
Yeah.
have good relationships and good attachments and high self-esteem
Right.
and lower risk of anxiety and
Yeah.
depression. So like,
Hmm.
if you were to pick one thing to focus on, it's just like really
Yeah.
being intentional about that relationship. Um,
Hmm.
and you're gonna make mistakes. So other
Yeah. Yeah,
that's just a
that's true.
given.
No, everyone makes mistakes, right? So it's
Yeah.
a natural part of life. And I think like there's a lot of us who kind of grew up with that trying to be perfect thing. And that's something
Oh
that
yeah.
I like specifically work on, to just let things go. And if it's like 80% there, like I'm just gonna move on to the next task. And
Yeah.
that was like a hard thing for me in my 20s to, really focus on, because sometimes it
Mm.
can be detrimental when you're focused too much on trying to get things perfect, right? But
Right.
I mean, like go on and on about stuff like this, but going back to like expectations from your family, I think one of the things that people in their 20s, they tend to get a lot of pressure and like a lot of questions on, especially girls, is marriage. Like,
Oh my
when are you getting
gosh.
married? Do you have a boyfriend? Like, all of these
Yeah.
things. And I'm sure you experienced that too before you got married. But how do we get our parents to stop asking us?
Well, the key thing first is that you can't
Hmm.
make your parents stop asking. So
So true.
letting go, yes, you
Yeah.
cannot make anyone else do anything. So,
Hmm.
yes, that's a
Yeah.
classic. But the best part is like
Hmm.
before you graduate college, it's like
Hmm.
no boys, no boys, no relationships, no
Yeah.
relationships. And then
Right.
you graduate and
Yeah.
it's like a light switch. Oh, where's your husband?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that in itself is like a whole just like
Hmm.
funny cultural
Right.
thing that we tease our
Yeah.
mom about to this day. Like, we weren't allowed to
Hmm.
date, but now you expect us to just
Yeah.
like show up with the husband. Like, how does that happen?
Yeah. No,
So
totally. So it's
yes,
like I was expected to have a secret boyfriend, but not tell you that I wasn't
yeah,
allowed to have a
pretty
boyfriend.
much. I
Yeah.
know. It's like if you just were honest, we all could have avoided a lot of
Hmm.
lying and sneaking around. But anyway,
Right. Yeah.
so what to say about that? So many things.
Hmm.
So first and foremost, you can't make your parents stop asking because it kind of
Right.
brings it back to
Mm-hmm.
the you can't control other people, you can
Mm-hmm.
control only yourself. So
Mm-hmm.
a few things. I think
Yeah.
if, you know, being kind of clear because it's annoying. It's like, haha,
Mm-hmm.
kind of cute and kind of
Yeah.
funny at first. And then you're like, okay,
Yeah.
like I'm over it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, please stop asking.
Right.
So, one thing I have
Yeah.
told people to do, just even in my personal
Mm-hmm.
life and also even
Yeah.
professionally, like, I
Mm-hmm.
know you're worried about me, mom and dad, and you really want me to settle down. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I get it. You want to make sure I'm taken care of.
Yeah.
I will let you
Yeah.
know when I have
Mm-hmm.
somebody, right? Like,
Right.
I'll let you
Yeah.
know when that day
Mm-hmm.
comes. Or something
Mm-hmm.
like I know it's important to you that I get married. I want to get
Yeah.
married too one day, if that is true for you.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
you asking me about it's not going to help, so I'm working on it,
Yeah.
right? Or just like kind of something
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Right. Yeah.
If you really want to set that
Mm-hmm.
boundary, I've
Yeah.
had people that I've known that said, if
Mm-hmm.
you ask me again, like I really don't want to, like,
Uh-huh.
I'm tired of this question. Like, if you ask me again, like I'm
Yeah.
going to leave. Like I'm going to walk out of the house or
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to hang up
Yeah.
the phone. And that feels harsh, but
Right.
sometimes that is a boundary you
Mm-hmm.
have to really set. Um,
Yeah.
and it really depends on your relationship with
Mm-hmm.
your family.
Yeah.
The other thing is kind of enlist the support
Mm-hmm.
of other people, which, so my
Yeah.
sister, she is a year
Mm-hmm.
older than me. She's single,
Mm-hmm.
living her best life.
Yeah.
But my mom every day asks her, when are you going to get married?
Yeah.
When are you going to look? Like,
Yeah.
rah, rah, rah. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I've had to be like, Mom, stop asking her
Mm-hmm.
when she, right? So
Yeah.
like I kind of like came in as a support
Mm-hmm.
person, like, we get
Right.
it. Everybody knows that what you
Yeah.
want, and you asking
Mm-hmm.
is not helpful. So like just you
Right.
really need to stop asking, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes it just does take that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh
Right. I think all the phrases that you mentioned were good ways of like one, like setting a good boundary around the question, but
yeah.
also just communicating that you're on the same page, and stuff like
Hmm.
that. I guess don't be like me and just give like snarky answers, but like
You
not share
can.
those.
You could do that in your 20s and leave your 30s for the, or
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
sometimes
I
will
mean,
be
usually I'm
funny,
just
like,
like, how am I supposed to know? Like, I can't like
yeah,
to, look into the future. Like, I don't have powers.
yeah,
Like, I'm not a wizard.
yeah.
It's just like funny things to say,
I
but it
know.
probably makes it worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, and I mean, and that's the thing, so if it's interesting, yeah, like we would
Hmm.
joke sometimes, we're like to our parents, like,
Yeah.
why would we want to get married? Like, we want to just live, you guys to take care of us forever.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and then, so there
That's
is
true.
room to make things light.
Hmm.
Everything doesn't have to be so heavy and
Hmm.
so serious.
That's
But
true.
if it is
Yeah.
something that is really starting to get to you, which it
Hmm.
can, then
Yeah.
being really intentional about how
Hmm.
you set the boundary. And I think a lot
Yeah.
of times it's parents' anxiety, right? That makes them keep asking,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Because it's hard for you to imagine now when you're young, but there is this like,
Yeah.
your parents want you to be taken care of and they know they're not going to
Hmm.
be there forever. And yes, we can
Yeah.
take care of ourselves as educated
Hmm.
women and all of that.
Yeah.
So, that's a whole other thing. We can take care of ourselves. And I think our
Right.
parents know we can
Yeah.
take care of ourselves. And
Yeah.
there's something as
Hmm.
parents get older and they age and they think
Hmm.
about
Right.
that kind of like what's going to happen when I'm not here. So,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
sometimes just saying, yeah, like I want to get married. I hope I find someone as awesome as dad one day or as awesome as whatever
Oh,
you want to
that's such
say.
a good
Like,
way to spin it. I like that.
yeah. Or like when I find someone as awesome as daddy,
Uh-huh.
that's when I'll get
Yeah.
married. So there are
Yeah.
ways to like have fun with it.
Hmm.
And there
Right.
there is can be a toxicity about it. So I don't want to
Hmm.
like
Right.
undermine that at all. The
Yeah.
question does get really
Hmm.
old really fast. Especially
Hmm.
when it comes from a place if you're feeling like, am I not like complete until I get married? Like what? Like, and
Hmm.
that's a really bad
Yeah.
feeling. And we are
Yeah.
complete as we are. We don't need a partner necessarily, to make us
Hmm.
complete, but it's
Right.
a different,
Yeah.
it's
Hmm.
just like a different stage of life. And some
Yeah.
people want it and some people
Yeah.
don't.
Right.
But
Right. No, totally.
yeah.
And I think there's also, like you said, um, a light-hearted way of kind of maybe changing the topic, or if,
Mhm.
of course, if it's like too much, you should set a little bit more of a firm boundary, like, please stop
Right.
asking me and stuff like that. But like usually you can kind of like answer it a little bit or give an update and, move on to the next topic or be like, I really
Mm-hmm.
want to tell you about, my job or something else
Right.
that's just gonna, make them feel like you're having a good life sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I personally know that I want to get married, but so I don't know if like you want to offer up any advice on like if you don't want to get married, how do you kind of communicate that?
Yeah, I mean, that is tough. And what I
Yeah.
will say is yes, it's
Yeah.
great to make things light and fun, but again, if it really is
Mm-hmm.
crossing someone's bound or if it's really impacting someone, they should set a firm
Mm-hmm.
boundary. Like, mom
Yeah.
and dad, like, I don't want to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to though talk
Yeah.
about like this promotion I got or this
Mm-hmm.
cool thing I'm doing at work or what I
Yeah.
did with my friends last week. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what I want to talk about. If you keep bringing up marriage, like I'm
Yeah.
gonna leave the conversation or I'm gonna hang up the phone,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just being very firm
Yeah.
and loving. You don't have to be disrespectful, right? I think that's another thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just being firm doesn't mean
Yeah.
disrespectful. For folks who,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, don't want to get married or
Yeah.
don't want to or want to have a life partner in different ways, whatever it may
Mm-hmm.
be, I think
Yeah.
that being very clear and sharing that with your
Mm-hmm.
family,
Right.
if you're prepared for the
Mm-hmm.
reaction they're going to have. I do think it's
Yeah.
important to kind
Right.
of think about
Mm-hmm.
how their reaction might impact you. But if you're in a place like, hey, like I
Mm-hmm.
am living my best life and I'm really like
Yeah.
happy, me and,
Mm-hmm.
my friends and,
Yeah.
my hobbies and all these things, like I'm
Mm-hmm.
feeling really fulfilled. And if
Yeah.
someone comes along that adds value to my life, I'll think about
Mm-hmm.
it.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Leaving the door
So
like a little bit open, maybe. Yeah.
yeah, if
Giving them
they
a little
want,
bit
or
of,
like I'm great.
yeah.
And if
Mm-hmm. Right.
this is not what I
Mm-hmm.
want for me, but if I'm flexible,
Yeah.
if my mind
Mm-hmm.
changes, I'll let you
Right.
know. Right?
Yeah.
Because we also don't have
Yeah.
to be so rigid. Our minds
Right.
change all the
That's
time.
true.
Sometimes people want
Yeah.
kids, then they don't want
Yeah.
kids, or they don't want kids, then they
Mm-hmm.
decide they do want kids or get
Yeah.
married. Like all those
Right.
things can change.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
saying like, yeah, if my mind
Yeah.
changes, I'll let you know. And you can send my
Mm-hmm.
bio data
Right.
around to everyone in the
Yeah.
country or whatever.
Yeah.
But at this
Yeah.
point,
True.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
not there yet.
Yeah. Yeah. True. And I think sometimes you also have to like say it a few times. So definitely, if someone's in that position, don't get frustrated if it's like, oh, I already told you, like, you're never gonna be like, I told you once and like we're in sync, right? So
Right.
there's gonna be that like continuous conversations and you're gonna have to say it a few times, say it a little bit differently, and it takes work to, be understood. And that's, part of being an adult. Like it's
Yeah.
a lot more difficult than it
Yeah.
seems like. Yeah,
Right.
go ahead.
And I think the other thing is
Mm-hmm.
like, I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people, and even when you're young, you get hung up like, but this isn't what I
Yeah.
want. So like, da da. But
Yeah.
sometimes it's like, all right, like, mom,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to go ask
Mm-hmm.
around and find someone for me, go
Mm-hmm.
ahead. Like, go look.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
she can't force you to talk to someone. She can't force you to
Yeah.
like pick up
Yeah.
when someone
Mm-hmm.
calls. But if she really wants to
Mm-hmm.
spend her energy like looking for that hidden
Yeah.
gem, go for it.
Mm-hmm.
When you find him,
Yeah.
mom, let me know. Right? And
Right.
like,
Right. Yeah.
so I think kind of,
Mm-hmm.
again, like, not getting too caught up in trying to
Mm-hmm.
control everyone around you. Like, in the end of the day,
Yeah.
you control. If someone calls you, you
Mm-hmm.
choose to pick up or not.
Mm-hmm.
Someone texts you,
Yeah.
like, hey, do you want to go out or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
You can always say no.
Right.
But if your
Yeah.
brown mom wants to just
Yeah.
like send the message
Uh-huh.
around on how she has this amazing daughter, just let her do
Right.
her thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. I think protecting your peace is a huge part of it, right? Like to not
Mm-hmm.
put so much energy into kind of the reverse of it too. Like don't try to, I think, really put a lot of time and effort into, getting your parents to like 100% agree with you and 100% be on the
Yeah.
same page. Because I mean,
Yeah.
no family ever really is, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's a natural part of just dealing with those relationships. And sometimes the less you worry, the happier you are in relationships, especially with your family. I think learning to balance that, where maybe you are compromising a little bit, like they agreed to stop asking you about, your future husband. Maybe there's like something else you can give a little bit on, and you just
Yeah.
find a balance, right?
Yeah. And definitely. And again, if it's like not
Mm-hmm.
impacting your day to day and,
Yeah.
uh, sometimes
Yeah.
just like deciding what you're gonna
Mm-hmm.
uh just kind of
Right.
let roll off
Yeah.
and what you're
Mm-hmm.
going to be firm
Yeah.
about, I think is
Mm-hmm.
just a part of,
Right. Yeah.
life.
True. On that note, as someone who's, a little bit ahead of me, do
Yeah.
you have any advice on for your brown girls in their 20s? Just to wrap up the
Hmm.
episode, any final pieces of advice for us?
Oh my gosh. About what? Just like life in general, or work, or
Just life,
family, or
yeah.
partners?
I guess we'll keep it on theme, like family and relationships.
Family and relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, for my fellow brown girls out there in their 20s, my biggest thing I think is
Mm-hmm.
uh number one, live life according to your values, right?
Mm-hmm.
If family is
Yeah.
really important to you, make sure you stay in touch with your family, right? If
Mm-hmm.
having friends is important to you, like make sure you see your friends. And if you want an
Mm-hmm.
X kind of career, like work towards that, like do those things. Relationships, friendships, family relationships, romantic
Mm-hmm.
relationships, all of those are some of the most like uh, priceless things.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
investing your time, I still,
Mm-hmm.
I'm still so close to my college girlfriends and friends that I grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think friendships are really important. I think be true to
Mm-hmm.
yourself, be authentic,
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, be bold. And
Yeah.
there's no right answer, right? There are,
Mm-hmm.
uh, if you want to have X kind of career, or if you choose, I want to get married and have kids
Mm-hmm.
really young and worry about career later,
Yeah.
whatever it is that you want to do, like
Mm-hmm.
it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't need anyone else's, like,
Yeah.
I should say anyone
Right.
else's
Yeah.
approval,
Everyone's
right? But like, I
right. Yeah.
think don't worry so much about
Mm-hmm.
what other people want you to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like choose your own
You
path.
know, yes, choose your own path. And best thing is,
Yes, I
keep
love
in touch with your
that.
friends.
Yeah.
Friendships are the best. Friends are,
Mm-hmm.
husbands are great. I love my
That's
husband. Love you,
true.
babe.
Yeah.
Love my kids, love my husband, but nothing compares to good girlfriends.
Yeah. As women, we need those female friendships. That's
Mm-hmm.
such a good point. I always say that
Yeah.
too. Thank you so much for sharing such wonderful advice and coming on my podcast and speaking so candidly and openly about so many topics, and offering up your own stories and being so relatable. I really appreciate that. And
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I loved chatting with you. I love to see all the awesome things folks are doing, and the voice that, you're giving brown
mhm.
people and immigrant backgrounds and all of that.
Hmm.
So yeah, just keep doing it. Always reach out anytime. Love to chat.